Okay, exact programming. We probably all wish that that training happened like this. So what we've got here on this figure is we've got training days along the x-axis and we've got load increments on the y-axis. And if we think, all right, each training session we're going to increase approximately 20%, what our training load increment would look like is something like this. But as we talked about before, there are so many different things that can happen in a 4-day period. And that might be something like people aren't recovering in the same way. There might be stresses outside of training. You might simply not have the opportunity to sleep the same or consume the same amount of nutrients. And so it's important to highlight, and I felt like it was really important to highlight, that progression is certainly not a linear thing. Progression can, sometimes we do the same thing for a week. Other weeks we can increase. Other weeks we might have to go back because we're a little bit tired. The next week we might be able to do a little bit more. But nevertheless, over time we start to get these progressions. And so progressing training must take into account all of the other principles in order to be effective. So don't blindly progress your training. Make sure that you're asking good questions to your clients about how they're responding to the training. Make sure that you're accounting for individuality, accounting for recovery, accounting for reversibility, maybe desired, maybe not. Making sure that you're training often enough in order to get the adaptations that you're after. But it is really important to highlight that progression, in my experience anyway, is not a linear thing, and you need to account for all of the other principles that you've learned about so far today. The training load and improvement. This figure here represents how important it is to be or to account for individuality within your training program. So what we've got is we've got two different athletes, and these athletes are marathon runners. They do a lot of training every week, lots and lots of running. So anywhere between sort of 40 kilometers and 240 kilometers of running, which is absolutely crazy. And the two different athletes we evaluated their VO2 max response to a training distance per week. So as an example, this athlete here, they were doing 40 kilometers of training per week and had a VO2 max of approximately 58 mils per kilogram per minute. Then when they started doing 80 kilometers of training per week, they had a slight increase in their VO2 max as a result of that training volume. Then they went to 120 kilometers of training and they had quite a nice improvement. And then we've got athlete B, who's in the red, and their starting VO2 max was obviously lower. They haven't got to the same level as athlete A, but the reason why I put this figure up is to highlight that athletes' training or fitness response to different workloads vary significantly. So if you take athlete A as an example in the black line, they have relatively similar VO2 max adaptations regardless of whether they're doing 120 or 240 kilometers of running per week. Conversely, you've got athlete B who's in the red. They're getting really good effects from doing really high volumes of training. So as an example, with athlete A, you might go, well, maybe our sweet spot is doing about 120 kilometers of running per week, or maybe even 160, somewhere in here. Doing an extra, 80% of volume on top of that might carry some sort of injury risk, but it also doesn't really come with any additional benefits in changes of fitness. Whereas if you take athlete B who's in the red, they get really good benefits from doing high volumes of training. And so what this figure represents is that individual responses are real. Different people require different training approaches in order to get the same fitness adaptations. And so as a really good coach, what you can do is you can use some trial and error, measure the amount of training that you're doing using effective methods, and using your testing in order to determine, what the most effective training approach is for you and your athletes. Overreaching is not really a common thing in the general population. It's also not really a common thing in team sport athletes either, but it is actually quite a common thing in, especially Olympic sports or sports that involve really high volumes of training. Overreaching might occur for a short period of time in team sports, but it's really not something that's a huge issue, especially in the more trained populations. Youth athletes are certainly more at risk. Perhaps the older athletes as well, and there might be like a sweet spot in the middle. But the reason why I highlight this is because that it's really important to space your training appropriately, account for recovery, and allow recovery to occur. And so, this might reflect someone in the gym who just goes and does biceps, 5 days a week and doesn't see any change. And that's simply because they're not permitting enough recovery and enough compensation from the training effect. So perhaps training a little bit harder and doing it less frequently is going to permit some sort of performance change. So if you are training too often, what you're not allowing for is the recovery processes to take place in order for those performance changes to occur. This one here is an undulating training prescription. So this is doing a training session here that has a training impulse, maybe a slightly harder training session here, maybe an easier training here, maybe harder training sessions here and a harder one here. And so what this does is it accounts for periods of high work and low work, and therefore it accounts for periods of low rest or recovery and high rest and recovery. And the concept of periodization really is about the distribution of work and recovery, and accounting for your ability to recover and permit an adaptive response. And so this is probably more reflective of what happens in the real world. There's going to be weeks in which you can't train. You might be getting to the end of semester, and training is not really going to be possible. So you're going to have maybe a slight down period because you're focusing on exams or practical assessments. But then what happens is semester's going to be over. It's going to be summer. You're going to have plenty of time to train, and you can do it more frequently, and you can expect some improvement to occur. So part of this is sort of working with your athletes or working with your clients and describing to them that part of this process is having some expectations around what we're going to see. You're not going to be able to train as much at the moment, and so therefore we don't expect to see you become more fit or become stronger. Simply what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the reversibility that's going to happen during this period. So let's just try and train a couple of days a week instead of the 4 as we normally would, because doing nothing, that's going to set you back a long way, and it's really hard to come back from that. So making sure that if you do have some undulating training prescription for whatever reason, you do coach people through it and you explain to them what the expected physiological or biomechanical processes or adaptations are going to be, so that you can manage expectations during that. And then the next one is some factors associated with recovery and adaptation. And this is definitely not an extensive list. There are so many different reasons why recovery and adaptation occur at different rates. So nutrition and supplementation is definitely one. The amount of carbohydrate that you're consuming, especially to drive anaerobic glycolysis, is important. Some supplements, there aren't many that have proven to have an effect on performance. Caffeine and creatine are probably the main two. Sodium bicarbonate is also purportedly to be effective for anaerobic glycolytic type work, 400 meter running as an example. Travel's a big one, especially in team sports. So when do you travel, and how can you mitigate the effects of travel on recovery? This is probably going to be a common one with a lot of different people that you work with. Their work or their schooling, and the different demands and the ups and downs that go along with the realities of that, is going to drive, how much people can sleep and their availability to cook good food, as an example. There's going to be psychological factors as well. So people's different, psychological ability to tolerate training, may mean that you need to reduce it in order to support them through the process. Their ability to maintain adherence, perhaps, might also drive that. Part of the coaching process is to try to maximize adherence. There's physiological factors. Choosing your parents wisely is always an important thing to do, if you want to get really healthy and strong. So simply by virtue of having, a particular genetic profile can really drive how quickly you can recover. There's going to be environmental factors. So environmental factors are things like what your home life is like. And so you might grow up in a particular culture that consumes particular foods. And those foods may be really conducive to the type of training that you're doing, and potentially not. So as an example, my wife is Greek, so we have a really sort of Mediterranean diet. But the Mediterranean diet's not fantastic for sort of the type of high intensity prolonged exercise that I used to do anyway, 400 meter running and such. So I'd certainly have to have a lot more carbohydrate than what would be common in that diet. Your social life, if you're probably a university student, recovery and adaptation is not going to be high on your priority list, especially on the Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday nights. But the people that you hang around, can be really influential in your approaches. So you've probably seen the Instagram memes about some people out on the weekends partying, and then other people in the gym. If that's what your friendship group like to do, then certainly pass no judgments. And and it's just sort of having an awareness of sort of people's social situation can have an effect on your recovery or your adaptation or lack thereof of recovery. Sleep is a huge driver, and there's lots of different textbooks that you can read about sleep, but it really is one of the absolute key factors in driving recovery. The neurological, psychological, physiological processes that occur during sleep are incredibly important to the way that your body functions, and so that's why the sleep sort of guidelines are pushed so hard. Is because it really underpins, a lot of these different things as well. So making sure that you get your 8 to 10 hours is incredibly important, especially if you're training hard. Recovery interventions are really common now. There's a huge market for recovery interventions. And that's like, if you wear this particular band on your wrist, it'll tell you about your recovery, or if you go and do an ice bath, or you go and do a contrast bath, or you wear these Normatec pants afterwards. It's important to sort of use our scientific lens to determine whether these recovery interventions are important. And so at this stage of your degree, certainly wouldn't expect you to have the ability to have some rigor around deciding which recovery interventions are useful or not. But hopefully over the course of your degree, really work on having an understanding about how to evaluate the literature that supports any of these recovery interventions. So the ones that I've sort of promoted during the presentation here today, sleep, nutrition, are definitely the most researched and the most valid approaches. And then, probably leaving the biggest one to last is your training. The amount of training that you do, drives the need for recovery and adaptation. And so as an exercise scientist, you really want to make sure that your exercise prescription around the training that you're doing is correct. And so what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to start working on your understanding of exercise prescription for different fitness components in different sport or skill related fitness components. And so then hopefully what you can do is you can integrate your understanding of exercise prescription along with all of the other factors that contribute to recovery in order to get the best adaptations possible for your athletes or your clients.